Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start tonight's story, I want you to think about something. In every courtroom, there are two kinds of people, the ones performing and the ones waiting. The performers talk loud, cry on cue, pack the benches with nodding relatives. The waiters sit still, say nothing, and let the performers build their own gallows one word at a time. Tonight's story is about a soldier who spent 5 deployments being called an absent father by the very people who were counting on his absence. A man who walked into a custody hearing with 3 rows of his in-laws sneering at his back. A lawyer telling him to fight. A judge asking if he had anything to say. And all he did was hand over one envelope. What was in that envelope emptied the room of smiles faster than a fire alarm. There's a real lesson buried in this one. About patience. About documentation. About why the quietest person at the table is usually the one you should worry about. So get comfortable and stay to the very end. Because the reason the judge sealed those exits is better than anything you're guessing right now. Let's get into it. Dalton Kerr learned to be patient in his father's transmission shop outside Girard Falls, Kentucky, where the rule was written in grease pencil on the wall above the bench. If you rush it, you buy it twice. His father rebuilt gearboxes for coal trucks and school buses, and by 12, Dalton could lay out 300 parts on a canvas tarp in the order they came off and put them back without a diagram. He wasn't the loudest kid in his class, or the fastest, but he was the one you handed something broken. When his father's heart quit at 51, halfway under a dump truck, Dalton was 19 and out of options that didn't have a recruiter attached. He enlisted, tested off the charts on the mechanical battery, and the Army did something rare and sensible. It put the transmission shop kid on helicopters. Over the next decade and a half, he became a chief warrant officer, a Black Hawk maintenance examiner, and eventually a team lead for downed aircraft recovery. The crews that fly out to wherever a helicopter went down, figure out why, and bring it home in pieces. His crews called him Deacon Kerr behind his back, not because he preached, but because of the way he made them redo checks, like the checklist was scripture. He carried his father's rule with him onto every airfield in the world, reworded for the job. Rig it, check it twice, then lift. Men came home alive because of how boring he was about it. He met Kara Stanhope at an air show in Louisville, of all places, where the Stanhope family had a corporate chalet with white couches and champagne, and Kara had wandered out to the static display line because she was bored of her father's clients. She was quick and funny and merciless about the way Dalton explained a tail rotor like it was poetry, and he was steady in a way that the men in her world never were. Her world was Stanhope Aero Supply, her father Edwin's company, a parts brokerage that bought and sold aviation components across 3 continents. Old hangars, new money, a family name painted on the tails of 2 private planes. When Dalton proposed, Edwin Stanhope shook his hand with both of his, the way politicians do, and said, "Welcome to the family, son. We take care of our own." It took Dalton 6 years to understand that sentence was not a promise. It was a warning. The wedding was at the Stanhope Lake House, 300 guests, and Dalton's whole side fit at 2 tables. His mother, his cousin, 6 soldiers in dress uniform. Edwin toasted, "My daughter who could have had anyone," and the room laughed warmly, and Dalton laughed too, because he was young and in love and hadn't yet learned to hear the blade inside that kind of joke. Charlie was born 2 years later, in the spring, while Dalton was on his 2nd deployment. He watched his son's first breath on a laptop screen in a plywood room in Kandahar, with a flight schedule taped to the wall behind him, and he made a sound the other warrants pretended not to hear. He was home 4 months later, and for a while everything was what it was supposed to be. He taught Charlie to hold a wrench before he could reliably hold a spoon. They built model helicopters at the kitchen table, and the ritual never changed. Charlie would slam the last piece in and shout, "Done," and Dalton would say, "Not done. Check it twice." And Charlie would sigh like it was the world's greatest injustice, and check it twice. And then they would fly it in the yard until the batteries died. But there was a gravity in Girard Falls that Dalton flew in and out of, and Kara lived in full time, and that gravity was her family. Edwin had a way of absorbing people. Sunday dinners at the big house were command performances. Doris Stanhope, Kara's mother, kept a seating chart in her head and moved people closer or further from Edwin, depending on their usefulness that month. Kara's brothers were already fully absorbed. Kirby, the older one, ran the warehouse operation with a padlocked annex nobody toured, and Palmer, the younger one, ran what the family called logistics, which seemed to mean a desk, 4 phones, and a constellation of companies that were just names inside filing cabinets. When Dalton was gone, the family closed around Kara and Charlie like water. Doris picked Charlie's school. Edwin paid for it before Dalton was told the number. Kara started doing the books, just helping Daddy while you're away, and by the 3rd deployment she had an office at Stanhope Aero Supply, with her married name on the door, and something in her had begun to point away from him, 1 degree at a time, like a compass being walked past a magnet. The 5th deployment was supposed to be his last. He was 41. He'd promised Charlie a summer of air shows and a half-built go-kart hung from the garage ceiling like a promise. The tasking was the kind he'd done a dozen times: maintenance standardization and downed aircraft recovery for an aviation task force spread across a hot, dusty triangle of bases he'd already given 4 years of his life to. Arlo Quaid was on that rotation. Arlo had been Dalton's friend for 11 years, a lanky maintenance test pilot from Tulsa who called every helicopter she and every problem rude, and who had a wife named Tansy and a daughter with Kara's exact birthday, which the 2 men had decided over cigars was proof the universe kept files. On the 63rd night of the deployment, a Black Hawk out of the northern base went down 8 minutes after liftoff on a routine logistics run. No enemy fire, no weather. It dropped out of the dark like a thrown stone. 2 crew members survived with broken backs. 2 died. One of the 2 was Arlo, flying right seat on a bird he'd signed off himself that afternoon. Dalton led the recovery. That was the obscene arithmetic of his job. The man who loved Arlo most within 500 miles was also the man trained to walk the debris field. He worked it the way he worked everything, slow and clean. Flags and grids and photographs. His grief folded up and put in a pocket like a letter he wasn't allowed to read on duty. And on the 2nd day, under a floodlight, in a crater of sand and transmission fluid, he found the tail rotor gearbox and opened it with hands that had done this 1,000 times and stopped being able to breathe. The bearing inside was wrong. Not worn. Wrong. The failure pattern was nothing like fatigue. The race had shattered like glass because the steel was garbage. And when he cleaned the part number to log it, the laser etching sat on top of grind marks. Someone had sanded off this bearing's real identity and given it a new one. It was a counterfeit, a fake part wearing a real part serial number like a stolen passport, and it had been installed, with paperwork that swore it was genuine, in an aircraft the United States Army trusted to carry its people. Dalton knelt in the sand, holding the reason his best friend was dead, and the part of him that had been a transmission shop kid, the part that believed machines don't lie, went very quiet and very cold. He bagged it, logged it, photographed the grind marks from 9 angles, and started the paper trail that would eat the next year of his life. Then he walked out past the light line, sat down in the dark next to a stack of rotor blades, and cried the way men do when they've decided it's the last time. The next morning he wrote 2 letters. One was to Tansy Quaid, and it took him 4 hours. The other was 3 lines to himself, folded into his breast pocket, and it said, "Find the batch, find the broker, rig it, check it twice, then lift." The Army's safety and materiel people did what they do, and it was real work, but it moved like a glacier wearing a safety vest. The metallurgy came back in 6 weeks and confirmed what Dalton's hands already knew. The bearing steel was a cheap alloy, hardness far below spec, a part built to look like a part. The serial number belonged to a legitimate batch made in Ohio in 2016, a batch whose genuine units were all accounted for. Somebody had manufactured ghosts and given them the names of the living. Dalton did the thing that made him Dalton. He pulled the paperwork thread, gently, 1 document at a time, from his plywood office 10,000 miles away. The bearing had entered the supply system through a defense logistics agency purchase from a small distributor. The distributor had bought from a broker. The broker's invoices listed a company called Blue Wing Components LLC, an address that turned out to be a mail store in Cincinnati. And Blue Wing's own supplier paperwork was signed by a purchasing agent whose name appeared nowhere else on the internet. It was a laundering chain, but for metal instead of money, each hop washing the parts a little cleaner of their origin. It took him 19 nights to find the mistake, because there is always a mistake. A single freight manifest, attached to the wrong PDF by someone in a hurry 3 years earlier, showed Blue Wing's warehouse of origin for a pallet of gearbox components. The address was 4400 Chalk Level Road, Girard Falls, Kentucky. Dalton sat looking at that line for a long time. He had parked at 4400 Chalk Level Road 100 times. He had eaten barbecue in its gravel lot at the company picnic. It was Kirby Stanhope's warehouse, the long gray building with the padlocked annex, the one nobody toured. The air conditioner hummed. Somewhere outside, a generator coughed. And Dalton Kerr sat very still in a plywood room with a photograph of his wife and son taped above the monitor, understanding all at once why Edwin Stanhope's parts brokerage had tripled its revenue in 6 years, why the annex was padlocked, why Kara's helping daddy with the books had become an office with her name on the door. His family's money was made of the same steel that killed Arlo Quaid. He did not call Kara. He did not call Edwin and scream, which is what Edwin would have expected and been ready for. He made a copy of everything onto a drive the size of a thumbnail, and then he went to see his task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hoyt Brumfield, a man with a handshake like a torque wrench, and said the 11 hardest words of his career. "Sir, I think my father-in-law is killing our people. I can prove some of it. I need someone federal." Someone federal turned out to be Special Agent Chandra Bliss of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, who flew into theater 8 days later with a laptop, a cig, and the flat, unhurried eyes of a woman who had spent 15 years watching defense contractors lie to her face. She listened to Dalton for 3 hours and said, "You understand what you're offering to do." It wasn't a question. From that day, Dalton Kerr had 2 jobs. By day, he ran recovery standards for a task force. By night, he was a confidential source with the codename Longbow, feeding Desus the connective tissue only an insider could see. Which cousin signed what? Which company was just Palmer wearing a different hat? What the family said at dinners about the certificate problem back in 2019, the year a foreman named Eustace Marr got fired for what Edwin called an attitude. And here is the part that would matter later. In a courtroom, more than anything else, Bliss asked him to extend. The investigation needed time to run subpoenas without spooking anyone, and it needed Dalton exactly where he was, far away, invisible, above suspicion. If he came home and started acting strange in Girard Falls, Edwin would feel it the way spiders feel the web move. So Dalton signed the voluntary extension. Then he signed another one. 14 months, when Charlie's go-kart was hanging from the garage ceiling. He missed a birthday, a Christmas, a first lost tooth, and he sat in a plywood room after every missed thing and reminded himself that the men in the next helicopter had children too. On video calls, Kara got cooler by the month, and then the calls started being missed, and then Charlie started saying things that came out of an adult's mouth. "Grandpa says the army must matter more than me. 7-year-olds don't build sentences like that. They repeat them." Dalton wrote the date and the exact words in a green notebook, the same way he logged cracked bearings, and said, "Buddy, nothing in this world matters more than you. Sometimes the people who love you have to be away to take care of things. When I'm home, I'll show you what I mean." He was careful. He was always careful. He never said a word against Kara or Edwin to his son. The green notebook was for the truth, and the calls were for love, and he did not let the two contaminate each other. What Dalton couldn't see from 10,000 miles away, Desus could. A subpoena to a Cincinnati freight company had, despite everyone's care, rattled a wall of the web, and Edwin Stanhope felt it. Edwin had not built a 9-figure business selling ghost parts to the government by being slow to smell smoke. He couldn't know who the leak was, but he could do the math. The family was watertight except for one seam, and that seam wore a uniform and asked quiet questions, and had never once, in 11 years, laughed at Edwin's jokes. So Edwin did what powerful men do when they can't kill a problem. He set about discrediting it. The campaign was beautiful, in the way a spider's web is beautiful. It started with dinner table drips, Doris sighing that Charlie cried at night, that a boy needs a man in the house, not a voice in a screen. Then Kara's new lawyer, a smiling shark from Lexington that Palmer had found and Edwin was quietly paying. Then the paperwork, a divorce petition, and with it a motion for full custody, drafted with real skill, painting in confident lawyer language a portrait of a man who had abandoned his family. 5 deployments, 2 of them voluntary extensions. The dates arranged in a neat exhibit like shell casings. He chose the army over his son again and again, the petition said. The word abandonment appeared 11 times. Dalton was served on a Tuesday at the task force headquarters, 4 days before he was due to fly home for good. Some clerk had timed it for maximum humiliation, and the young specialist who had to hand a chief warrant officer that envelope looked like he wanted to die. Dalton read all 40 pages standing up, without his face changing, while 2 of his sergeants pretended very hard to be interested in a clipboard. Then he called Bliss on the encrypted line and said, "They just told me the venue." Bliss said, "The venue for what?" And Dalton, who had spent a year learning to think like her, said, "Where the whole family shows up at the same time, on the record, on a date certain, through a metal detector. My custody hearing, Edwin will pack that courtroom to watch me lose. You've been telling me for months you're afraid of go bags and the family plane the day indictments unseal. So don't unseal them a day before. Unseal them in that room." There was a silence on the line, the sound of a federal agent falling a little bit in love with a plan. Then Bliss said, "Longbow, you're describing using your own custody hearing as a trap." And Dalton said, "No, ma'am, they built the trap. I'm just not going to warn them it's load-bearing." He flew home to a house he no longer had keys to. The locks were new, the porch light was off, and his garage, his father's tool chest, the go-kart on its hooks, had been emptied into a storage unit whose bill was, in a touch of pure Doris, forwarded to his new address, which was a 2-bedroom apartment by the airfield with carpet the color of oatmeal. The machine ground forward. At the temporary hearing, Kara's shark asked for supervised visitation, citing instability and reintegration concerns, and got half of it. Dalton got alternating Saturdays in daylight, which he attended with the punctuality of a man being graded, because he was. He rebuilt the model helicopter ritual in a rented apartment with a boy who now flinched slightly at loud noises and had been told, gently, by 3 separate adults, that Daddy might move away soon. Dalton wrote that down too. His lawyer was a fierce, precise woman named Faith Okabe, who had spent her career watching money fight families, and even she told him, across a table, "Dalton, I can beat some of this, but I have to be honest. They have years of your absence. They have his school records. They have a child therapist Palmer found, and they have a town your father-in-law owns. If we fight it straight, we likely lose." Dalton looked at her for a moment and said, "Then we won't fight it straight. We'll fight it slow." She said, "You understand the hearing is in 11 weeks. He said, "I know. It's tight. Some things I'm waiting on take about 10. Okabe had been in family law for 19 years and had never once had a client smile while saying the timeline was tight. She wrote one word on her legal pad and underlined it. The word was patience. The 10 weeks that followed were the strangest of Dalton Kerr's life, because he had to lose slowly in public while winning slowly in private, and he could not let either performance touch the other. In public, he was the quiet respondent in Kerr v. Kerr, showing up to depositions where Kara, coached, lipsticked, flanked, looked at a point slightly above his head and described a marriage Dalton didn't recognize, a father who was essentially a stranger to Charlie. He listened to her say it and remembered her laughing at the air show, and grieved for the woman being slowly digested by her own family, and said nothing, because the green notebook was for truth and the deposition was for rope. Let them have rope. In private, the case was assembling itself like a set on a stage. Eustace Marr, Stace to everyone, the foreman Edwin had fired in 2019, turned out to have left the Stanhope warehouse with a cardboard box that wasn't full of desk toys. Stace was 66, went to the same church as half of Gerard Falls, and had spent 4 years feeling sick about what he'd refused to do, and sicker about what he hadn't reported. When Agent Bliss knocked on his door, he looked at her badge for a long moment and said, "Took y'all long enough," and went and got the box. Inside were 6 bearings, 2 data plates, and a hand-drawn diagram of the annex at 4400 Chalk Level Road, the room where serial numbers went to be sanded off and reborn. He'd refused to run the grinder. Kirby had run it himself, with the door open, laughing. Meanwhile, the paper told the rest. Blue Wing components and 4 sister shells traced back through Palmer's registered agents, test certificates forged on a stolen letterhead, and this was the piece that made 2 prosecutors stand up at the same time. Kara's initials, KSK, on internal Blue Wing transfer manifests, 17 times over 4 years. Whatever Kara had told herself she was doing for Daddy, she had signed it. The The grand jury heard it all in a federal building 2 hours away and returned a sealed indictment naming Edwin Stanhope, Kirby Stanhope, Palmer Stanhope, Doris Stanhope on 2 obstruction counts, 3 warehouse employees, and Kara Stanhope Kerr. Wire fraud, mail fraud, trafficking in counterfeit goods, defective parts fraud against the United States, and, attached to the Quaid crash and one other, a charge whose name Dalton read 3 times because it finally matched the size of the thing. Fraud resulting in death. The warrants sat sealed in a safe, waiting on one logistical problem, the same one Bliss had named a year earlier. Edwin kept the family jet fueled at a strip in Tennessee. Kirby had moved money to Belize. The morning the family learned of indictments, from any leak, in any pattern of arrests that started with the smallest fish, the big ones would scatter. The government needed every Stanhope in one room, at 1 hour, on a date the family themselves would never move, in a building where firearms walk through magnetometers and deputies guard the doors. Edwin Stanhope, master strategist, had chosen that date himself and mailed engraved invitations to his own arrest. He just called it Dalton's custody hearing. Bliss took the plan to the U.S. attorney, who took one look at the security logistics and made the calls. The marshal's service, the county sheriff, and, in chambers, under seal, 2 days before the hearing, Judge Bernard Selby of the Girard Falls Family Court, who listened to 2 federal prosecutors explain what was going to happen in his courtroom and was heard, through the door, to say only, in 31 years. Dalton was given exactly one instruction for the day. Sit still, say nothing, and when the moment comes, hand the judge the envelope. Not evidence. The envelope was ceremony, a sealed copy of the unsealing order and the operations notice, so the judge would have in his hands the reason his courtroom was about to change hands. Bliss slid it across a diner table to him the night before and said, "You've waited 14 months. Can you wait one more morning?" Dalton put it in his breast pocket, next to where a 3-line letter had lived for a year, and said, "Ma'am, waiting is the only thing they never learned to beat." The morning of the hearing, the Stanhopes arrived like a victory parade. 3 rows, Edwin and Doris in the front, with Kara between them, Kirby and Palmer and their wives behind, then cousins, the Lexington Shark and 2 associates, even the child therapist Palmer had found, everyone in courtroom best, everyone wearing the small, confident smile of people attending a formality. Edwin worked the room like it was his lobby, shaking the bailiff's hand, nodding to the clerk by name. Somewhere across town, Charlie sat in his school classroom, deliberately kept clear of all of it, drawing, his teacher would later tell Dalton, a helicopter. Dalton came with Faith Okabe and sat at the respondent's table in his dress uniform, which the Shark had already told the judge in a pretrial motion was a costume calculated to manufacture sympathy. 5 rows of ribbons. A costume. Dalton had asked Okabe not to fight the motion hard, and she hadn't understood why until later. He wanted them confident. Confidence is loud, and loud people say things on the record. The morning was a controlled demolition of Dalton Kerr, and he sat through it with his hands folded, in a stillness that first-time observers mistook for defeat. Kara testified that Charlie cried for a father who was never there. "He abandoned our son for years," she said, voice cracking exactly where the Shark's outline said crack here. "And now he wants to walk back in like none of it happened." Behind her, 3 rows nodded in unison, a chorus rehearsed at Sunday dinners. The Shark walked the judge through the deployment exhibit, 5 tours, 2 voluntary extensions, choices, Your Honor, not orders. Doris took the stand to say, with a mother's sad courage, that she'd practically raised that boy while the respondent chased medals. Edwin himself testified last, magnanimous, more in sorrow than in anger. "I don't doubt the man loves his country, but my grandson needs a father, and you can't mail that in." He looked directly at Dalton on the way back to his seat, and gave him a small nod, one hunter to a mounted head. At 11:40, the Shark rested. Judge Selby turned to the respondent's table, glanced at the clock, and asked whether the respondent wished to be heard before the lunch recess. The courtroom rustled, gathering coats. Okabe stood. "Your Honor, my client would like to hand up one item." The Shark objected. Nothing in evidence, nothing disclosed. And Selby waved it off with the weariness of a man expecting a photograph of a soldier and his son, and said, "It's a custody hearing, counsel. I'll allow the gentleman his envelope." Dalton rose, crossed the well in 4 steps, and handed it up. Brown, letter-sized, sealed. His own name nowhere on it. The judge slid it with a thumb, unfolded 3 pages, and began to read. And the courtroom, 3 rows of it still smiling, watched the color leave Judge Bernard Selby's face, like water leaving a sink. He read the first page twice. He looked up at Dalton, one long, unreadable look, the look you give a man you have badly misfiled, then past him, at the gallery, at the front row, counting. Then he pressed the intercom and said words no one in that room ever forgot. Bailiff, seal the exits. Nobody leaves this courtroom. Counsel, approach, now. For 3 seconds, nobody moved, because the sentence made no sense in the grammar of a custody hearing. Then the main doors opened, not burst, just opened, calmly, on schedule. And men and women in blue windbreakers with 3 yellow letters on the chest came through every door at once. The main doors, the clerk's door, the jury room door nobody had noticed was ajar all morning. Federal agents entered through every exit simultaneously, which is what it looks like when someone has had 2 weeks and a floor plan. And Edwin Stanhope, 71 years old, master of rooms, did the single most honest thing of his adult life. Before a word was spoken, before a badge was raised, while his own lawyer was still standing at the bench with his mouth open, he grabbed his coat and went for the side door. He made it 11 feet. A marshal who had been posing as a courtroom sketch artist all morning stood up, folded her pad, and put a hand on his chest like a turnstile. "Edwin Roth Stanhope," said Agent Chandra Bliss, coming up the center aisle with the warrant in her hand and 14 months in her voice. "Federal agents, you're under arrest for fraud against the United States resulting in death." The room came apart in slow motion. Doris stood up screaming about lawyers and was gently sat back down and cuffed with a tenderness that somehow made it worse. Kirby put his hands flat on the bench in front of him like a man who had rehearsed this in his mirror for years. Palmer went the other way and tried to become small behind his wife until 2 agents lifted him out of the row by the armpits. A filing cabinet finally opened. The Lexington Shark announced to no one that he was terminating representation, effective immediately. And Kara stood frozen between her cuffed mother and her cuffed father, in her carefully chosen courtroom dress, and turned, last of all, to look at her husband. Dalton had not moved from the respondent's table, hands still folded, and in that one look between them, the whole architecture of the last year finally rendered for her, why the leak had never been found, why he'd extended twice, why a man being publicly gutted for months had never once fought back. Her lips shaped a single word, not a defense, a question. "You." Dalton held her eyes and answered the only thing that was true, quietly, but in the kind of quiet a silent courtroom carries to every corner. "Arlo Quaid signed his aircraft out at 1400. Your family's bearing came apart at 2109. You initialed the manifest, Kara, KSK, 17 times. He stood, straightened his jacket, the costume, and said the rest to the front row, to Edwin, in handcuffs, whose face had gone the gray of old solder. "You wanted the judge to know why I was gone 5 deployments. Now he knows. Somebody had to recover what you buried." Judge Selby watched the marshals walk the front row out one by one, and into the stunned quiet he said, "For the record," in a voice that wasn't entirely steady, "the petition before this court alleges abandonment. In 31 years on the bench, I have never seen a man less absent. We're adjourned." They found the annex at 4400 Chalk Level Road exactly as Stace Marr had drawn it, down to the grinder. The trials took most of 2 years, and Dalton attended every day he wasn't working, sitting behind the prosecution next to Tansy Quaid, who held his arm during the metallurgy testimony and did not once look away. The government proved 704 counterfeit components moved into the military supply chain across 9 years, connected the steel to 2 fatal crashes and 11 groundings, and read into the record the names of the dead while the Stanhope defense table studied its legal pads. Edwin got 32 years, which at his age was arithmetic everyone in the room could do. He had a stroke of pure showman left in him and told the sentencing judge he was a businessman failed by his suppliers. And the judge replied that the court had heard the tape of him in 2019, saying certificates were cheaper than metallurgists. Kirby got 19 years, Palmer 14, Doris 30 months for obstruction. She'd fed documents into a barbecue smoker, which the prosecutors, being human, had photographed extensively. The company was dissolved. The lake house, the jet, the chalet money, all of it fed a restitution fund for the crash families, and the first check out of it went to Tansy Quaid's daughter's college account. Kara pleaded. Her cooperation was real, in the end. She was the one who explained the books to the jury in her father's trial, in a flat, ruined voice. And Dalton believed she had signed the manifests the way people sign things at kitchen tables in families like hers, without asking, because asking wasn't done. It bought her 30 months and a felony, not innocence. The family court that reconvened that fall spent 40 minutes on what remained of Kerr v. Kerr. Dalton got sole custody. Kara, when she came home from Alderson, got supervised Sundays that Dalton, over Okabe's raised eyebrow, never once tried to take away. Because Charlie loved his mother, and Dalton refused to teach his son that love is a thing you weaponize, even though, or maybe because, he had just watched a whole family do exactly that. He retired a year later at 43 with a flag, a medal citation that read, in dry federal language, sustained conduct at grave personal cost, and a signed photograph of a DSIS field office pretending to be a courtroom sketch class. He took over a hangar at the Girard Falls airfield and started a small business doing aircraft inspections, honest ones, and the only decoration in his office is a shattered bearing in a glass box. Underneath it there's a brass plate with no name and no date. It just says, check it twice. The go-kart came down off the hooks, finally, and got finished in a rented garage by a boy who now checks things twice without being told, who came home from school one cold September afternoon, dropped his backpack, and found his father waiting in the yard with 2 helmets. The last thing Charlie shouted, as they rolled out onto the grass runway with the sun going long, was done. And you already know what his father said back. So that's the story of Dalton Kerr. And I keep coming back to one image, 3 rows of people nodding while a man sat silent, every one of them certain his silence was weakness. Here's what I take from it. First, patience is not passivity. Dalton lost in public for 14 months on purpose. He absorbed the word abandonment in a court document while holding proof that his absence was the most present thing a father has ever done. Most of us can't sit on a truth for 14 days without needing to be understood. He did it because he'd decided that being understood matters less than being effective, and that is a brutally rare kind of strength. Second, documentation beats performance, every single time, eventually. The Stanhopes ran a machine built on paper, forged certificates, shell companies, a custody petition. It never occurred to them that paper is a game 2 people can play, and that the quiet man in the corner had been keeping a green notebook and a chain of custody the whole time. When performers meet records, records win. Third, and this is the one that stays with me, notice who never has to raise their voice. Edwin filled 3 rows with nodding relatives because he needed a chorus. Dalton came with a lawyer and an envelope. Confidence that's real doesn't need an audience. It needs a date certain. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me one favor. Think of the quietest person in your life and ask yourself what they're carrying that you've mistaken for absence. Drop your thoughts below. I read them all. If you want more stories about patient people and expensive mistakes, you know where the subscribe button is. Until next time, this is Nathan. Check it twice.